good morning. Good morning in US time. Hello, everyone. What a fabulous day so far. It's been so wonderful to follow talks by Dana Boyd and the recent one by Sophia Noble, which was incredible. So, people, today we've been told to cancel the apocalypse, right? So here's our mission. To try to fix the world before it ends, to move beyond dark visions, the valley's techno-determinism, dystopian dreams, and a defensive resistance, to reignite our imagination and explore the future as an open set of political possibilities rather than a predetermined algorithmic prediction. Absolutely. But how? How are we to do this, especially given the fact that many of us feel like we're already living the apocalypse? For everyone within the US, I mean, forget science fiction. Just try living out your life. So here's what I propose. To explore the future as an open set of political possibilities, we need to question, that is to probe and move beyond, not only dystopian, but utopian dreams. So we need to question, to examine the pasts, presents, and futures embedded within our technologies and imaginaries, and to displace these eugenic temporalities. So I want to think of the E here as eugenics, right? So displace the eugenics that's embedded within some of these temporalities. Because here's the point. If our present seems to make 80s dystopian science fiction look banal, it's because of the visions, the hallucinations, the small a apocalypses that have framed political problems as problems technology could and should solve. So hope, easy promises of hope, security, and global prosperity, these have spawned the hellish echo chambers, the unrelenting surveillance, and the unprecedented human behavior experiment that's co-produced transnationally by states and corporations. So there's a lot to say and not a lot of time. So I'll focus today on questions of race and racism, questions that, as Sophia Noble pointed out earlier, have a long history. And race and racism have been central to the emergence of the internet as a mass media to end mass media. Race and racism have been central to the emergence of the statistical methods that are embedded within a lot of machine learning algorithms. So to cancel the apocalypse, we need to take on these deep-seated logics. At the very least, to expose and address the default assumption and axioms that ground these data structures and algorithms. And what I'll also suggest is that in order to cancel the apocalypse, we have to be a little perverse. So what I'm going to suggest is that we take the racist results of a lot of these algorithms and use them as diagnostics. So read them against the grain as evidence for already existing discrimination, and also use them to crack open and address some of these inequalities. And what we need, among so many other things, is to imagine new algorithms, new worlds, new republics. Okay, so how do we do this? Part one, cyberspace was supposed to be a trash fire. So, let me warn you, this is the longest section. If we're still here halfway through, don't freak out, okay? So, it seems pretty clear that the internet is a trash fire, right? Filled with angry, paranoia-inducing echo chambers, military-grade surveillance and clickbait, cyberbullies, and an infrastructure that's anything but neutral. And I love that Lisa Nakamura is teaching a course next fall at Michigan called The Internet is a Trash Fire. And every day, we're faced with new evidence of racist and discriminatory algorithms. So last year, ProPublica and BuzzFeed revealed and documented the ways in which Facebook and Google inadvertently use racist phrases to sell targeted ads, right? So Google added all sorts of racist phrases to white people ruin. And Facebook enabled advertisers to reach people using anti-Semitic phrases drawn from the interests of people who were deemed to be like them. These, of course, are just two of many. Others include Beverly Skeggs and Simon Yule's work on how Facebook exploits the poor through predatory advertising. Sophia Noble's really excellent book on how searches on black women perpetuate porn and racism. And revelations that the software used by US courts to predict the risk of recidivism and thus used by some courts to determine both sentencing and parole is biased against racial minorities. And this algorithm was actually sued unsuccessfully within the US. And it was sued unsuccessfully because the Supreme Court said it wasn't the only thing being taken into consideration, right? So these programs, as Cathy O'Neill has argued, have become or threatened to become weapons of mass destruction. Or as Pinboard has put it, machine learning is like money laundering for bias. Okay, but if this is true, what can we do? How can we put things right? Well, apparently, one thing you can do is apologize. And here you see Zuckerberg before the Congress apologizing. But it's not just Zuckerberg who's saying sorry. New York Magazine recently published an article in which the internet itself apologizes. Right? That is, if you reduce the internet to tech execs, network architects, and visionaries, almost all of whom live very close to each other in this natural disaster-prone desert called the Valley, right? And here you see their mea culpas and explanations, right? So the old guys blaming the new guys, you have social media folk blaming the bullies and the trolls, and you have execs blaming the advertising models that foster clickbait. And here you see their diagnostic in 15 easy steps, right? So you start with good intentions, it's the hippies, then you add in capitalism, you have Wall Street. The problem is we wanted it to be free, everything was addictive, no one was held accountable, et cetera, et cetera. Now, clearly, things need to change. And there are real problems with the advertising model, with regulation, and with questions of accountability. And as a Canadian, I'm all for saying sorry, right? I don't know how many of you have spent time in Canada, but saying sorry is a national pastime, right? And we say sorry as aggressively as we play hockey, right? We're like, wow, that was a really good one. Okay. I'm all for saying sorry, but these 15 steps miss a lot of things, and they rewrite history. There's a difference between apologizing and being an apologist. Right? And Lanier is always provocative and insightful, and his comments are amongst the best within this article. But last I checked, socialism doesn't mean exploiting users for their free labor in order to become rich, right? And it's telling that these folk, rather than all the users, are deemed to be the internet. Tiziana Terranova, of course, analyzed all of this at least a decade ago in her really excellent piece, Free Labor. And these 15 steps again, they misrepresent the past. It's not as simple as utopia gone bad, right? For one, the internet was always a trash fire, right? So how many of you remember the internet in the mid-1990s when it was, remember the days of Usenet, right? Before even cyberspace, yeah, exactly. So in the mid-1990s, we had Hollywood producing movies about how sending your credit card online was an invitation to murder, right? And we had all these articles about how the internet, cyberspace, was a pornographic badlands. We had to keep our children away from it. And it was unclear in the mid-1990s that the internet would take off, that it wouldn't die the same way the video phone did. How many of you remember Clifford Stoll's prediction that the internet would never take off? Right? Because it's filled with trolls and harassment. Because there's no safe way to send our credit cards online. And yes, he was wrong in many ways. There are now online markets, etc. But there's still no entirely safe way to do e-commerce. But it just wasn't Stoll, right? Many scholars were talking about how all this cyberspace stuff, now I have hockey on the mind. Okay, all this cyberspace stuff was just hype. And hello, people, cyberspace, that is the good internet, was literally 1980s dystopian science fiction, right? So remember Neuromancer? William Gibson developed the term cyberspace in 1984 in his cyberpunk novel, Neuromancer. And Neuromancer takes place after the apocalypse, after World War III, after the destruction of the working classes and the criminalization of the working classes through rampant global capitalism. So after Japanese multinational corporations have taken over the world. So cyberspace literally was an apocalypse, right? A hallucination, a vision, a consensual hallucination, and a medium so addictive that Case, the protagonist, turns to drugs to get over cyberspace. So it's really weird that an actually existing technology, an old technology, became new in the mid-1990s by becoming conflated with 1980s science fiction. Especially since going online, for all of you who booted up Mosaic back then, looked nothing like this, right? And importantly, Gibson wrote Neuromancer before ever owning a computer. He based this off visions of video games. Now, what's key is that this dystopian future became utopian through a certain embrace of bodilessness as solving all our political problems for us, right? And here you see John Perry Barlow's infamous declaration of the independence of cyberspace, where he argues that cyberspace is a space of the mind. And because it's a space of the mind, it's outside of all forms of discrimination, right? Now, this seems a little hokey. But what we need to keep in mind is that this internet, this utopia, didn't come before business models and advertising. This was the business plan, right? And to make this point, I'm going to have you all revisit that MCI ad.
People here communicate mind to mind.
There is no race. There are no genders.
There is no age.
No age.
There are no infirmities.
There are only minds.
Only minds.
Utopia?
No.
The internet.
Where minds, doors, and lives open up.
Is this a great time or what?
Okay, so this ad was just one of many. And in the mid to late 1990s, it seemed impossible to advertise the internet without happy people of color, without featuring happy people of color, declaring there were no happy people of color online, as indeed there weren't, or very few, and those of us who were, as Anna Everett has documented, weren't going around saying there is no race. And tellingly, these commercials got pulled from the US airwaves as soon as cyberspace started taking off. So you could only watch them on Japanese TV, right, where they were still trying to promote internet usage. And a certain paranoid logic drives these commercials, right? So it depends on you seeing this commercial and saying, of course, these people would be happy to be online. Right? So the message of these commercials and this advertising isn't even the banal don't discriminate. It's get online if you want to avoid being discriminated against. And the message is also, if these people are already online, so should I, right? So Cisco Systems had all those people, are you ready? We are commercials. And importantly, the same companies that were running these commercials were also running roundtables about the digital divide. Again, the point was not social justice. The point was getting as many people online as possible. And debating whether or not the internet really is a race-free utopia is far more conducive to getting people online than whether or not the internet is really a pornographic badlands. Now again, this all seems kind of hokey to us now, right? How could anyone believe this? But this was and is still present. Snowden, for instance, claims that he decided to leak data to risk incarceration because he remembered this internet. This internet, when children from one place of the world could be treated equally as experts from other people in the world. And this logic, this dream, lives with us still whenever AI or any technology is embraced as a way of getting rid of human bias. Right? We have to remember that a lot of these programs are sold as solving the problem of human bias. So Facebook fired its human editors after it was accused of being biased against conservative news. Machines, it's assumed, can't see difference and therefore can't discriminate. Although, more cynically, it's probably because they can't talk to reporters off the record yet. Right? And Compass was sold as solving the problem of individual bias. Right? So sentencing, they've shown, depends a lot on a judge's circadian rhythms. So if you see the judge before lunch when he or she is hungry, you're going to get a much harsher sentence than if you see them after they've been fed. So the idea was to eradicate individual bias. And importantly, these programs claim not to use race explicitly. And so it's argued if they don't explicitly use race, they can't be racist. As Kate Crawford and others have shown, the problem is that race, gender, and other protected categories are present even when they're not. So even programs that don't explicitly use race implicitly do so through the proxies and the neighborhoods that they set up. So they replace individual bias, as the ProPublica article argued, with aggregate bias. And that's really key when it comes to prosecution, because within the US at least, you can only prosecute on the basis of individual intention, not aggregate bias. So the proprietary Compass program used to predict recidivism, asked people to fill out a questionnaire. And here you see part of the questionnaire, in which they ask questions about their families and their friends. Are their parents married? Are their friends involved in the judicial system? And the actual weighting of these factors is proprietary, but it's pretty clear that your friends matter, that your sentencing depends on who you know. And one of the questions that the police, who are also asked to fill out this questionnaire, fill out is, do they think this person is involved in a gang? And this is even more clear in the Chicago Police's heat list. So to combat the growing homicide rate in Chicago, the Chicago Police created a heat list of the 400 people most likely to kill someone or to be killed. Right? They then visited the top 12 people on this list, right? Which made a lot of people think they had just watched too much TV, right? Because this actually follows the plot of Person of Interest. Now, to come up with this heat list, the Chicago Police didn't use overtly racial categories, and they didn't just study people's actual behavior. They studied their social networks. Right? So they put people on the heat list not just because of what they've done, but based on the action and histories of their algorithmically determined neighbors. So because of their friends, they became persons of interest. And race didn't need to be an overt factor because it was already factored in through a long history of segregation and discrimination. And it was factored in because network neighborhoods presume segregation. They segregate users into clusters based on similarities. And here you see how race gets factored into those algorithms through things such as education, housing, and family structure, all produced by the authors of the ProPublica article. Now, a lot of the pushback against these algorithms and criticism has focused simply on the use of race, rather than racism. So the underlying belief still is, if we only got rid of tracking race, if we only didn't see race, things would be okay. As if the problem was or is the simple existence of proxies rather than what these proxies do. And this is part of the problem. So if we want to cancel the apocalypse, we have to take on the really hard question of how do we take on racism, especially when categories of race are crossed out. And to do this, we have to examine the fundamental assumptions behind network science. Because baked in within these networks, as they're currently configured, are profound assumptions of segregation, discrimination, and history. Profound assumptions that these apologies don't even come close to touching, which is part 2, our cybergenic moments. Now, to start thinking about this, I'm going to start with a clip from the really controversial Cambridge Analytica video.
Clearly, demographics and geographics and economics will influence your worldview. But equally important, or probably more important, are psychographics. That is an understanding of your personality, because it's personality that drives behavior, and behavior that obviously influences how you vote. So how is this possible? Well, at Cambridge, we've rolled out a long-form quantitative instrument to probe the underlying traits that inform personality. This is the cutting edge in experimental psychology known as the OCEAN model. OCEAN being an acronym for openness, how open you are to new experiences. Conscientiousness, whether you prefer order and habits and planning in your life. Extroversion, how social you are. Agreeableness, whether you put other people's needs and society and community ahead of yourself. And finally, neuroticism, a measurement of how much you tend to worry. By having hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans undertake this survey, we were able to form a model to predict the personality of every single adult in the United States of America. So how does this impact marketing and communications in elections? For a primary, the Second Amendment might be a popular issue amongst the electorate. If you know the personality of the people you're targeting, you can nuance your messaging to resonate more effectively with those key audience groups. So, for a highly neurotic and conscientious audience, you're going to need a message that is rational and fear-based or emotionally based. In this case, the threat of a burglary and the insurance policy of a gun is very persuasive. Conversely, for a closed and agreeable audience, these are people who care about tradition and habits and family and community. This could be the grandfather who taught his son to shoot and the father who will in turn teach his son. Obviously, talking about these values is going to be much more effective in communicating your message.
Okay, so Cambridge Analytica claims to know your personality even if you've not filled out its survey, because it's come up with proxies, such as buying an American car, you're apparently an extrovert if you like Lady Gaga, an introvert if you like philosophy, in order to predict personality. And you'll note, even though they claim not to use race, the face of conscientious neuroticism is a well-groomed white female. And according to Christopher Wiley, who's the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Steve Bannon was the only straight man he met who understood feminist intersectional politics. And feminist intersectional politics is thinking race, class, gender, and sexuality together, and was developed by women of color feminists such as Kimberlé Crenshaw. Bannon apparently sees culture as central to politics. He adheres to what's been called the Breitbart Doctrine, the idea that you have to change culture in order to change politics. And according to Wiley, Cambridge Analytica went one step further. It argued that to change culture, you have to change people, that people are the units of culture. Now, we have to take a lot of these assertions with a grain of salt. There's a lot we don't know and can't know about the impact of Cambridge Analytica. The problem is that there's just too many false positives. But what's crucial is that these ads, these campaigns, were developed as transformational emotional experiences. The goal was to have you, as Dana Boyd pointed out this morning, take the red pill, right? So you click on one link, then you go through a series of sites that repeat a certain message so that you come out at the end a different person, right? Or you make some hacker really rich who's figured out the difference between the auctions on Facebook and Google. Now, even though Cambridge Analytica claimed that individuals are the unit of culture, what they sought to do was to manipulate and create clusters. The goal was to put you in an echo chamber with people like you, people with whom you share a passion, or you share the same triggers, in order to get you to spam each other relentlessly. Right? So these ads are designed to accentuate fear, angst, and humor, to place people in a highly affective condition, because when you're most agitated with people you trust, you act most predictably because you act in relation to triggers. And again, folk are put into these network neighborhoods not based on the majority of their likes or dislikes. They're put into these categories based on their most intense or their most odd dislikes. So depending on how they deviate most distinctly from the norm with others. So based on their so-called authentic moments, where authenticity, being yourself, means being slightly deviant. And there's a ton more to say about authenticity as training people to act slightly badly. There's a reason why the 2006 elections were called the authenticity elections, but no time. So here's just a little teaser from Twitter. But consider this study, which revealed how easy it is to reveal a person's age and gender based on their publicly declared Facebook likes. So as Kaczynski et al. Revealed in this much-cited and highly influential 2013 PNAS article, it's really easy to determine a user's race, gender, sexuality based on publicly available information. And back in 2013, Facebook likes were publicly available. And they came up with predictions not only for physical traits, such as race and gender, but also psychological traits. And this is because over 58,000 volunteers filled out that personality questionnaire that was going around Facebook asking you, do you want to know what kind of personality you are? And if these categories look familiar and Kaczynski rings a bell, it's because he's been linked to Cambridge Analytica, although Cambridge Analytica has denied this link. But to produce these results, the researchers created a vast user-like matrix, which they then decomposed into the 100 most relevant components. And here you see the most correlated likes for IQ and sexuality. Look at these closely. What's key is that you matter, your actions matter not in isolation, but in relation to others. Data is most valuable, most useful for authentication and prediction only when it's authenticated with and against others to be deemed to be like you. So through your neighbors, through people deemed to be like you because they like what you like, they hate what you hate, you're captured even when you're silent. So Kaczynski used an initial training set of users and likes to come up with their weighted correlation matrix that was then used to predict the status of others. And this is clearer in their 2015 article where they lay out their method for matching personality types. So basically they use 90% of their data as a training set to build a linear regression model. They tested it against the remaining 10%, and they predicted your identity, your personality type, your latent class by weighing these manifest actions. Now, this clustering isn't innocent. It creates and is used to create identities and borders. Again, what's important isn't the majority of likes, it's the likes that divide. So it's not that everyone who has a high IQ likes curly fries. It's just that those who are deemed not to have a high IQ don't like curly fries. So these are odd, specialized likes that cluster because they divide. These correlations, in other words, build walls. And these walls occur at many different levels because network science presumes segregation. At the heart of network science is the axiom that similarity breeds connection, that birds of a feather flock together, that like acts like like. And here you see the abstract from Stevens, Smith-Loven, and Cook's much-cited review article of homophily. And homophily drives collaborative filtering. Collaborative filtering groups users and objects into neighborhoods based on boundary-defining likes and dislikes. So homophily structures networks by creating clusters that make networks searchable and predictable. But what's so insidious about these neighborhood models is that they assume that neighborhoods should be segregated, that neighbors should be like ourselves, that you show love by hating others, by literally fleeing when others show up. So if we manage to love our neighbors like ourselves, it's literally because they've become ourselves. which of course massively perverts all Judeo-Christian-based ethics. And a really retrograde notion of identity grounds homophily. And so here you see the definition of homophily from one of the most respected textbooks on network science. And I have the deepest respect for the work of John Kleinberg and David Easley. But look at all the assumptions that are built into this definition of homophily. Think of everything you need to accept as natural for this to be true. Right? Think of all the training, the planning needed to make this true. And importantly, we're talking about a whole history of state-sanctioned segregation within the US, right? Which these books have documented. There are no random defaults. In other words, the default is the fault. Right? And why are there defaults called your preferences? Right? Now, the links between homophily and US segregation are deep and profound. Homophily was actually first coined in 1954 by sociologists Lazarsfeld and Merton. And in that chapter, they also coined the term heterophily. But the term heterophily has completely disappeared. What's also disappeared is the fact that they came up with these terms while actually studying US segregation, while studying these two communities. And more importantly, when they were studying these communities and coming up with the term homophily, they just focused on the white residents. Homophily was describing the relationship between white liberals and illiberals. And there's a ton more to say about homophily and its link to racist reactions against desegregation. I could talk about Schelling's model, et cetera, as well as Sarah Ahmed's diagnosis of white supremacism, but we have no time. Because I also want to at least touch on the historical ties between eugenics and the statistical methods that are being deployed in machine learning. Now, as we've been told over and over again, big data is so big because it relies on correlation rather than causality. So rather than making hypotheses about why things happen, it enables us to know the future by revealing hidden but actually existing correlations. This means knowledge now means knowing the future. But consider again those correlations for IQ. And it's said over and over again that these aren't causalities, these are just correlations. Right? We're just pointing out what's out there. But how are these correlations constructed, and what do they mean? So not surprisingly, the Pearson correlation coefficient used in many recommendation systems to determine similarity and linear regression were developed as tools to prove the truth of eugenics. They were developed in order as tools to understand human heredity. So Pearson and Galton were both eugenicists, but they were biometricians rather than Mendelians. And they developed linear regression, or which Galton initially called linear reversion, in order to understand the sort of literal regression or decay of English society. So Galton developed linear regression, which is now used to determine the best fitting line between scattered points. He developed it entirely differently in order to understand deviation, right? So most simply, linear regression assumes a linear relationship between an independent and dependent variable, such as y equals mx plus b, where m and b are constants. But intriguingly, Galton's conception of linear regression differs in purpose and in order from this now standard procedure. So Galton specifically formulated the notion of linear reversion while studying the difference in size between sweet peas and their offspring, and later the difference in size between human parents and their offspring. And he drew a line and sought to determine the slope not between 2 points on a given line, but between the deviations from the norm. So what mattered to Galton was showing how exceptional traits were lost generation to generation if they weren't carefully bred. And Pearson and Galton, again, were biometricians rather than Mendelians. They were anti-theory. Mendel to them was theory. And Pearson, in particular, viewed correlation as a necessary supplement to causality. And his argument of correlation over causality in many ways resonates with some of the rhetoric that we're hearing now. And here you see Pearson's solution for canceling the apocalypse. A eugenic logic that uses the inheritance of unchanging attributes to build the future, to know the future. Okay, but it's not just Pearson and Galton, it's not just regression and correlation, but also methods that ground pattern recognition. So here you see one of the first case studies for the automated construction of decision trees, AID. And this was taken from Adrian Mackenzie's really wonderful book, Machine Learners, in which he argues that pattern recognition instrumentalizes differences. Yeah, but look at the first example, right? Look at what difference it trains on. And it's not just examples or the data that's used to generate decision trees or classification and regression trees, although clearly this is important, right? So these models are verified on their ability to predict past data. If the past is racist, then their predictions have to be racist in order to be verified. Okay, but it's not just examples used, right? The very notion of node purity or impurity resonates with eugenics. And it's telling that the impurity measure for classification trees is the Gini index of diversity. Diversity undermines pattern recognition. It undermines node purity. And support vector machines, which are key to pattern recognition, stemmed from linear discriminators, which were developed by another British eugenicist and father of modern statistics, Sir Ronnie Fisher. And he developed linear discriminators, as the name implies, to literally discriminate between species and races, to mark their differences, to render continuous changes into discrete traits, to mark the edges of races. The point was to find the boundaries between seemingly mixed cases. And Fisher drew from Mahalanobis's craniometric work in India. So this researcher wanted to determine the effects of racial mixing within the Indian population by literally measuring people's skulls. And he starts by considering the English-Indian hybrid, but ends by arguing that there's always been hybridization, but only between equal castes. And SVM, with its use of high-dimensional space to amplify borders, complicates LD, but the principle of focusing on and determining boundaries remains the same. And R.A. Fisher, like Pearson, wanted to change the future. He wanted to cancel the coming apocalypse by using eugenics, right? And he, like Pearson, believed that intelligence was hereditary. And because of this, Fisher was against all social uplift programs, right? And here you see a quotation from him. He argued that attempts at wholesale social promotion led to the retardation of the cultural progress of every class of the community, an unneeded strain on the educational system. So his solution to the apocalypse, to the decline of English society in the early 20th century, was to give more money to the rich so they would reproduce. Right? The goal was to make sexual selection and natural selection once more coincide. The goal was basically to get the English to act like authentic, heroic barbarians, right? Sound familiar? Okay. Now, to be clear, my point isn't that any use of these statistical methods is eugenicist, but rather, if the world now seems closed, it's because these methods were designed to predict the future based on an unchanging and unchangeable past. In this world, there is no nurture. There is only nature. There are no deviations except for statistical noise. As Pearson put it, intelligence cannot be learned, it can only be bred. In this present, the future can be calculated, but it cannot differ radically from the past. Okay. So what do we do? Well, one thing we have to realize is that we never have to accept segregation. We never have to accept the defaults and the programs we're given. And although this will entail more than building new algorithms and new programs and treating them differently, this is one place to start. Okay, so first, what if we started treating these algorithms like global climate change models? Think of what global climate change models do. They portray the most likely future. They portray a future we don't want, so we'll change it. They show us the most likely steps, so we'll do something different. So what if we analyze these social networking models and their political consequences, not in terms of did they really have the influence they had, which leads to a whole bunch of A/B testing and even more weird behavioral experimentation, right? But to ask, what factors have been put in place? What present are we living in that makes these futures seem plausible? Right? So what if we treated these models and results as pointing to underlying problems that we need to fight? What if we use the space between model and prediction as the space for political action? At the same time, realizing that probably the last thing we need right now are more models, right? What we need right now is action. But these actions, these imaginings, they can start with networks and they can be small. So what different future could we imagine? What different future could we create together if we simply questioned our default assumptions? So importantly, Milton Friedman, evil architect of neoliberalism, urged his followers not to focus on disruption or crisis, these happen all the time, but rather on habits. Right? So he admonished his followers to seed new habits so that the improbable becomes probable. So what if we took these correlations and turned them into correlations? So what would happen if we used the fact that Wu-Tang Clan is apparently one of the most correlated markers for male heterosexuality? What would we do with this mix of Hong Kong martial arts, cinema, Staten Island hip-hop, and Jacques Cousteau, right? What would happen if we explored how we're all entangled, how our actions affect each other, how every individual is collectively formed? So what would happen if we weren't shunted into homophilous echo chambers? What would happen if these ties were based on difference rather than similarity? What if they were based on heterophily, the notion that opposites attract, right? So this is how electromagnetism operates, right? How many of you know people who are heterosexual? Okay, that's reverse homophily. Apparently it happens, right? Better yet, what if we use something like mutual indifference? What if we used our mutual indifference as ties? What other forms of navigation and recommendation could be revealed? That is, what if we took the Combahee Collective's challenge to treat all people, in particular Black women in the US, who have been traditionally the most oppressed, as levelly human? So this collective of Black feminist socialists were the first to theorize what's become known as intersectionality. So the importance, again, of thinking race, sexuality, class, and gender together. And importantly, it's from an embrace of identity that they come up with a call to be treated levelly human, for a recognition that belies pattern recognition. And importantly, Data for Black Lives Matter has argued that in the light of Cambridge Analytica, in the light of what's happened with this leak, anonymized Facebook data should be made available. That data belongs to users. That the kinds of privacy that Facebook has offered they're woefully inadequate and damaging. And there's a long history within the US of defining privacy, who has the right to privacy in racial terms. Now, this call raises all sorts of questions about the effects of anonymity and whether we can really have anonymized data. But it also points out that networks are fundamentally public. So what if rather than retreating into these really banal and impoverishing notions of privacy that actually undermine our safety, we took on the very public nature of networks, and we took on and addressed the collective threads of identity? What if we came up and developed public rights that were as rigorous as privacy rights? What if we, following Kara Keeling's call, took care of our bodies and the bodies of others because we're so intertwined? What if we used our data shadows to create public spaces in which we're open and vulnerable and yet not attacked? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. It was an absolutely amazing talk, and I think the best use of privacy that I have ever seen. I don't think, unless you want to squeeze in one really quick question. One really quick question. Whose hand is going up? It's so bright. You're all so shiny. If you've seen a hand, person with microphone, please hand it on. Thank you. Quick question, please, quick answer.
That was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. You're talking about the apocalypse. Are there any aspects of the impending apocalypse that you didn't get to, that you may have had to cut for time, that should be on our radar?
Oh, yeah, so much. Wow, I've been working on this for years. Oh, wow. So I think that part of the work that I had to cut out looks at the deep history of segregation that's baked within some of these models, especially agent-based models. So Schelling's agent-based model to explain how micro motives can lead to larger movements such as segregation is actually it bakes white flight into these models. The other thing that I think we need to really study is the importance of Boston to all of this. So Schelling, Granovetter, et cetera, they were all writing about Boston during the desegregation period and civil rights movement. And so I think that rethinking and putting that into consideration is important. Also, I'm quitting my job at Brown. I'm going to Simon Fraser University as a Canada 150 chair to start a digital democracies group. So I have funding, yes. So I have funding for postdocs, graduate students, you name it, to build some of this stuff, prototype new networks, work on abusive language online, bring together humanists, computer scientists, social scientists. So if you have any questions, come work with me. And Vancouver is brilliant. Great.
Be